The wind that swept across the fields that night carried more than winter's chill. It whispered of burnt fields and stolen grain, of soldiers half-starved and children fully forgotten. You are standing in the mud-crusted courtyard of a peasant homestead in early 14th century, France near the edge of Brittany where conflict bleeds into daily life like ink through parchment. A boy of perhaps 7 winters, clad in wool, patched so often it resembled no single garment, tightens his grip on a struggling rabbit. His fingers are red from cold, knuckles cracked. His name is Etienne, though no record in the royal court will ever note it. He was one of many children whose stories slipped beneath the pages of history. The soldier before him, a Gascon mercenary hired by a local noble, sits heavily by the hearth. His face lit harshly from one side, his surcoat is stiff with old blood, his hair matted from days without a wash, and his mood unyielding. He does not ask for kindness. He has seen enough of war to mistrust even a gift. But Etienne steps forward anyway. Life beneath the war this moment, quiet as it is, arises from decades of political disorder. The Capetian kings, once stable, are now embroiled in disputes over inheritance, and regional lords leverage hired blades to defend fragile claims. Peasant villages caught between learn the art of disappearance of hiding tools, grain, and sons. These are not stories of generals and treaties. They are stories of boiled roots and empty barns. You imagine yourself in Etienne's world? The walls are daub and timber, patched with bits of linen to keep wind from seeping through. Smoke from the hearth curls into the thatch above. Meals are 2 things, warm or not. The adults whisper at night of taxes doubled again, of distant battles whose results never seem to change their lives except to worsen them. And yet in this child's hands is a rabbit. A rabbit snared with quiet skill passed from a mother who no longer speaks. Perhaps the last one in the area not already. Eaten. Why offer it? The answer is not simple. Perhaps the boy sees something in the soldier's face. Or maybe he was told to do it, to buy safety with meat. Maybe even if it's a child's twisted hope to make a friend of the monster. The soldiers rode the manna named in the tale. Though we'll call him Arnaut, as many Gascons were, had not always been a mercenary. He had once been a cooper's son, trained to build barrels, until a levy called him to war. The 100 Years' War would not officially begin until 1337, but its seeds had already taken root. France was a quilt of friction. Soldiers like Arnaut often lived off the land, a polite way of saying they took what they could. Pillaging was as much a part of the profession as wielding a sword. Nobles might sanction raids to starve enemies. Peasants became both currency and casualty. Yet Arnaut had grown tired. Not soft, never that, but tired. He had buried comrades in frozen fields and watched men die over hens. He'd eaten boiled leather once, and it stayed with him. So when Etienne extended the rabbit with both arms, as if it were some holy relic, Arnaut did not strike the child or sneer. He simply looked. But crucial, firewood and trust in many ways. This exchange, silent, dimly lit, is about survival far more than glory. The hearth itself plays a key role. Firewood was a resource of genuine scarcity. Villagers often sent children miles to gather it, risking wolves or bandits. To offer warmth or to share heat was no less generous than food. Etienne's family, his mother and sister, both hollow-eyed, had not spoken during the offering. They waited behind the thin curtain of bundled rags. The decision, perhaps, was mutual. Or perhaps it was Etienne's alone. Arnaut accepts the rabbit slowly, and then, without speaking, he pulls from his pack a hunk of salted meat. Far harder than the rabbit, but valuable all the same. He tosses it onto the table. Not as payment, he doesn't owe these peasants anything, but perhaps as symmetry. The hearth crackles. The hearth is history. You may wonder, why dwell on such a moment? Why record this when popes crown kings and empires rise? Because the real fabric of history is not woven from coronations and declarations alone. It is stitched from moments like these when survival required grace and war passed silently through a kitchen. The rabbit would feed them all that night. Etienne's mother would later boil it with cabbage. The soldier would sit near the fire, longer than needed. By morning, he would leave without taking anything else. Some say he spared the village when others would have burned it. Some say he remembered his own boyhood, a brother lost in a frost like this one, but no one knows for sure. Unfinished threads. What became of Etienne? Was he forgotten like so many? Did he grow into a man who fought, or did he remain tied to the land? 2 rabbits, 2 hearths, and what of Arnaut? Did he die in a later skirmish, buried in snow? Or did he lay down arms someday and build barrels again? History doesn't say. It is a story without a climax, but not without meaning. Because sometimes the quietest offerings, made in flickering firelight, are the ones that hold back the chaos. Only for a night. Morning brought a thin mist over the village, softening the frost-crusted earth. In the distance, crows picked at something unidentifiable along the tree line. The soldier, Arnaut, had already vanished, leaving behind faint boot prints and the half-eaten remnants of the rabbit stew from the night before. The hearth was cold again. The firewood is nearly gone, but nothing else was missing. No doors had been kicked in, no goats or chickens led away by rope. The women of the house, Etienne's mother and older sister, did not smile, but they moved with slightly less stiffness. It was not joy, it was survival, what a village could endure you. Living in the 14th century would understand that peace was rarely measured in seasons or treaties. It was measured in days without theft, weeks without levies, years without plague. Villages like this one, likely no more than 25 souls, were built of endurance more than wood. Most peasants were serfs, not slaves exactly, but not free either, bound to the land, tied to a local lord whose taxes came in sheaves of grain and forced labor. They were anonymous in the records. Their names appeared only on tithe rolls or in death tallies. During plague years, they kept no journals. They carved no grand statues. Yet they shaped the soil and fed the future. Etienne's family had once numbered 6, his father gone 4. 3 winters now had marched with a levy raised by the Count of Penthievre. No word had come since. His 2 younger siblings had perished the year the rains did not stop. The roof still sagged where the water rotted the beams. Now it was just Etienne, his mother, and his sister Jezebel, who had seen 12 summers and bore the expression of someone who'd already survived too much. And this soldier, this Arnaut, had passed through like a shadow without taking more. The village economy, quiet calculations. Life here revolved around a subtle, often unspoken economy. Every family bartered what little they had. One might trade goat's milk for a bundle of thatch. Another might repair a fence in exchange for help digging root cellars. No coin changed hands. Coin was for cities and lords. What mattered was memory. Not in stories, but in debts owed and favors recorded mentally across seasons. Etienne's rabbit had value, not just in meat but in the gesture. Word traveled quickly. Old Jean, the tanner, whose eyesight was going, nodded slowly when told the tale. That boy's smart, he muttered. Knows the game. What game? The game of reading people, of calculating danger, of knowing when to give, even when you have almost nothing left. In a land ruled by castles, it was often children, like Etienne, who made the smallest but most crucial choices for their kin: lords, taxes. In the weight of silence, the lord who claimed dominion over this village, Baron Thierry of Les Chains, lived some 6 miles away, in a crumbling stone keep staffed with fewer men than it once boasted. He visited once per year, escorted by men-at-arms. His steward collected rents. His herald read edicts no one understood, and yet his banner was stitched on the communal flag in the chapel, such as it was, little more than a wood-framed hut with a painted cross above the door. The village paid in oats, hides, and hard labor. Some seasons, they gave more than they could afford. In other seasons, they gave up children, pressed them into house service, or conscripted them during feudal disputes. No one spoke against the Baron, not out of love, but out of wisdom. Resistance got people noticed. Getting noticed led to punishment. And so life continued, exhausting and rarely recorded. But stories like Arnaut's, those got remembered, not in ink, but in breath, passed on from one winter to the next. Etienne, in the memory of the soldier Etienne, young as he was, had no idea what he had done. Not really. He knew the rabbit was food. He knew soldiers were in danger. He knew giving something valuable to someone dangerous. After, when other travelers passed through, the villagers would glance toward Etienne's home. The boy who gave the rabbit, they'd say, half whispering, they didn't praise. That wasn't the way, but they remembered. Even years later, long after his sister Jezebel married into a neighboring hamlet and his mother passed quietly in spring, Etienne's name would be uttered with the same flat reverence reserved for those who had acted rightly when it mattered. Real boredom, salt, bread, and sleep. Let us pause just for a moment to reflect on what these lives were really like, not the drama of armies and lords, but the actual experience of existing. Bread was everything. Coarse rye or barley, dark and heavy. Baked once or twice per week, often mixed with legumes or even ground bark when times were tight. Salt, hugely valuable. It preserved meat through the winter, treated wounds, and was occasionally paid as tribute to monastic communities. Sleep came early. Firewood was too precious to burn late. The dark was not feared, it was simply endured. Sleep came in two parts. The first, sleep until midnight, then waking briefly to check animals or stir embers, followed by second sleep until dawn. This segmented sleep was normal. Disease was frequent, yet unremarkable. Coughs and rashes, worms, fevers. No one rushed to diagnose. You either endured or you didn't. It was boring. It's painfully so. But this was life. It's as it is. Moment his rabbit and his risks stood out as exceptional precisely because so little else ever changed. The return of soldiers 1 week after Arnaut's departure, 3 more soldiers came. These were not like him. They were not quiet, and they did not sit by hearths. They arrived at dusk, drunk and cursing. They demanded food and fire, and when none was offered quickly, they helped themselves. A goat vanished. A cartwheel was stolen. Someone's daughter was followed into the woods. This, too, was normal. But what was not normal was what happened. Next, Etienne stepped forward, small, quiet. He told them of the other soldier, the one who had shared meat and taken nothing more. He pointed to the bare hearth and said simply, "He was better than you," and that made them laugh. Ugly, raucous laughter, but they left the next morning with less violence than they could have caused. Not because of fear. Soldiers like these understood shame. Memory, the only history. There were no scribes in Etienne's village. No written history. Nothing to inscribe this story onto the record of mankind. But memory served its own role. A generation later, when war returned again, and this village faced burning under yet another flag, a local leader made a curious choice. He sent his sons to negotiate, not with swords, but with salted meat. And some whispered it was because, long ago, a child had once done the same with a rabbit by the fire. Unresolved thought, but here is a quiet puzzle to leave you with. What? If Arnaut had not accepted the gift, what if he had simply taken the rabbit, or struck the boy, or burned the house like so many others? Would the village still have survived? Would Etienne still have mattered? And how many histories, how many quiet acts of grace have we simply never heard because no one thought to remember? Years passed as they do, unrecorded in scroll or book, but etched clearly into the rhythm of life. The village where Etienne had once offered a rabbit to a soldier remained unnamed on most maps. Its boundaries were defined not by fences or ink, but by memory, where the trees grew sparse, where the river curved just so, where a particular stone had marked the death of a lost ox. Etienne grew taller, its face lean and pale, bore the permanent squint of one who spent too long scanning horizons for travelers, some welcome, most not. His hands, once too small to properly skin a rabbit, became those of a craftsman, not a knight or scholar, but someone without whom life would have frayed. A carpenter's apprentice, Etienne became, in time, a woodworker. Not by inheritance, as his father's tools had been taken by the steward after his disappearance, but by observation and patience. He spent a season watching old Raymond, the village's bent-backed joiner, who mended plows and crafted humble benches. Raymond had no sons and even fewer words. But when Etienne fetched his tools one frostbitten morning without being asked, a sort of agreement formed. No parchment, no contract, just shared labor and silence. Etienne learned to plane wood smooth, to listen for the sound of a warped board, and to patch cracked wheels with dowels made from seasoned ash. He crafted tool handles and gate latches. Eventually, even coffins, practical heavy ones, often needed on short notice. It was not noble work. It was not glorious. But it held a village together. The value of staying in a century defined by movement pilgrimages, war, and famine-driven migrations, Etienne stayed. He did not go to the cities, where guilds ruled and the plague returned in cycles. I did not follow soldiers or seek fortune under banners. He stayed because someone had to. And staying, in a time when everything seemed to fall apart, became a form of quiet rebellion. He fixed carts so food could be moved. He reinforced roofs so families could survive winter. He carved wooden crosses for graves of people whose names would never be sung, but who had once shared bread or stories. He married a girl named Alex, whose hair always smelled of smoke, and whose father had once lost 3 goats to passing mercenaries. They had 4 children, 2 of whom survived past infancy. Their home grew slowly, with each beam nailed carefully into place. The hearth was never empty. On certain nights when soldiers were seen on the road, Etienne's family always prepared a small pot of stew, just in case. The rabbit retold the tale of the rabbit never left the village. By the time Etienne had graying temples and his first grandson, the story had already taken on new shapes. Some said the soldier had cried. Others said he had given Etienne a coin. Of pure silver? One version claimed the soldier returned years later to become the village watchman allikely. But stories often grow like ivy around a truth. Etienne himself never corrected anyone. When asked directly, he would shrug and say, "I was hungry." He was hungrier. But once, after a funeral, he told his youngest daughter the truth, that the fire that night had seemed warmer, not because of the rabbit, but because of what hadn't happened, the fear that had not become real. "It's strange," he said softly, "how many days you remember because of what didn't happen." That line, too, became part of the tale. Daily threads of the forgotten, there's a temptation, even now, to search for more some grand twist, some hidden royal connection. But there isn't one. Etienne was never knighted. He never met a king. His children never built cathedrals or composed poetry. They lived. That was enough. He buried his wife in the same clearing where he used to snare rabbits. He outlived his sister. His tools passed to a grandson who became known for making cradles so sturdy they were passed down through generations. Etienne died on a cold morning. In his sleep, his last breath taken beside a fire that had burned low but not gone out. How we know the story, you might ask. How do we know any of this? It's a fair question. The village kept no records. Etienne left no will, no carving with his name, but the story lived orally for centuries. When a traveling friar recorded local legends in the early 1600s, half-truth, half-memory, he wrote of the boy who gave the rabbit and the soldier who spared a home. He mentioned a small village near Brittany that, for reasons unclear, was never sacked during the worst years of the 100 Years' War. The friar did not call it a miracle. He simply called it unusual, but we can imagine. We can follow the thread backward. From the friar's notes to a carving style unique to a region, to the oral retellings of families whose names match none in royal records. We trace the story, not through proof, but through plausibility, through the warmth of its familiarity. And that, too, is history. The lasting shape of small choices. You might now consider how many similar moments have gone unrecorded. How many children offered kindness? How many soldiers hesitated? How many homes were saved by nothing more than a bowl of hot stew or a single soft word? These are not dramatic tales. They do not end in fanfare. But they are the skeleton of history, the quiet bones beneath the skin of war and empire. Without them, the grand events would collapse. Final reflection, Etienne's story ends as it began, beside a fire in silence. No medals, no monuments. Just a moment of mercy, remembered retold, and perhaps lived again every time someone chooses kindness. In the shadow of violence. And so, the rabbit, small and trembling in a child's arms, became more than a meal. It became a memory. The year is 1297. You are sitting in a dim stone chamber beneath the old treasury at Westminster. It's the kind of place that smells of wax, damn, parchment, and quiet urgency. The torches flicker low against walls lined with chests of scrolls, rolls, not riches. This is not a vault of gold. It is something far more powerful. This is the exchequer. And among the sea of ink-stained men sits a clerk named Elias de Wareham, hunched over a sheet of vellum, scratching a line of numbers that will never be remembered but without which a kingdom might fall apart. He is not famous. No portrait of Elias exists. He will never ride in procession or speak to kings. But if you looked closely at the backbone of Plantagenet England through the wars, the taxes, the food shipments, the roads, it would bear the handwriting of men like him. The silent machine of a medieval bureaucracy, we rarely think of paperwork as a tool of power. But in the medieval English government, it was everything. The kings of England, especially Edward I, then on the throne, could not raise armies, build castles, or wage war against Wales or Scotland without first consulting the figures. Those figures came not from generals or bishops, but from clerks. And it was a boring, tedious, relentless job. The exchequer, whose very name means chessboard from the checkered cloth used to calculate sums. It was a world of ledgers, tally sticks, seals, and summonses. Every shire, borough, and manor owed something, and someone had to record, calculate, and question every coin and grain of it. That someone, more often than not, was Elias. A day in Elias's life. Elias's day began before dawn bells. He lived. In shared lodgings near the abbey, 2 other clerks to a room, each with trunks of bundled documents tied in string. His robe was woolen, ink-marked, and stiff at the cuffs. He had worn the same belt for 9 years. A breakfast was weak ale and dry bread. Not because he was poor clerks earned a modest stipend, but because habit, once set, rarely changed. Arrived in the chambers below Westminster, just as the sun barely brushed the tower stones. Already, carts had arrived carrying rolls from distant counties, parchment scrolls marked with wax seals, tied with ribbons, listing rents, fines, and debts owed to the crown. Elias's job? To check them all, carefully, mercilessly, a missing farthing meant a fine, since an inconsistency could trigger a sheriff's summons. He compared sums across years, noted fluctuations in harvest, and deduced fraud from sloppy handwriting. Sometimes he added annotations so dry they cracked with dust. 3rd barrel of rye seems short, see previous year's measure. Suspect false tally. Tally sticks and precision. One of the most curious tools Elias used was the tally stick, a split stick of hazelwood, notched to record debts. One half was given to the debtor, the other kept by the exchequer. If they matched years later, the debt was proven. It seems primitive. But it worked, because wood could not be altered easily. The notches were standardized. Large debts were marked with deep, distinct cuts. Small payments were thinner, closer together. It was bookkeeping by knife. Elias often ran his fingers along the grain, feeling the differences, comparing them to the written rolls. The sound of tally sticks being split echoed through the chamber like dull thunder, paperwork in its loudest form. The hidden power of the clerk. What many didn't understand was that clerks like Elias had quiet power. A noble might ride through town with banners flying. A sheriff might carry a sword. But Elias could, with a stroke of ink, note that a manor had failed to pay its obligation, and months later, soldiers would arrive. He could delay a payment by changing the order of names on a roll. He could advance a career by transposing a date. Not because he was corrupt, he was, in fact, quite honest, but because every system has its unseen gatekeepers. In a land where only a small fraction of the population was literate, and fewer still numerate, Elias's knowledge was as precious as any knight's sword. Bureaucracy in the age of war, it's easy to forget that all of this was happening during an era of war and conquest. Edward I was raising funds to invade Scotland. Roads were being built. Bridges needed repair. Taxes were constantly increasing, not just from noble landholders, but from towns, villages, abbots, and even Jews, who were heavily taxed and persecuted during this period. And someone had to calculate it all. When Edward needed to raise £20,000 in astronomical sum at the time, it wasn't the crown jewels that made it possible. It was a room like this one, and a clerk like Elias, who sorted through thousands of entries, confirming who owed what. Boring. Incredibly essential. Absolutely. The clerk and the guard. One day in autumn, a small commotion broke out near the stone steps leading down to the exchequer. Guard, newly assigned and unfamiliar with the rhythms of record-keeping, stopped a delivery cart. He questioned the contents, suspecting treason or theft. Elias rose from his desk. Quiet, methodical, and bespectacled, he approached the guard and said simply, "Inside that chest are the wheat records for Devonshire. They will determine whether the king eats well this winter." The guard blinked, confused. Elias nodded. Slowly, "You are guarding the sword. I am guarding the stomach." The guard said nothing but let the cart pass. The other clerks said little of the moment. But later, over ale, one muttered, "He's right, you know. If we stopped writing, the kingdom would starve." The boredom of civilization. Let's pause here. We think of civilization as built by armies, kings, and visionaries, but it is also built perhaps more truly by ledgers, by people who spent their lives counting sacks of barley, measuring timber, recording fish quotas, and noting who held which acre and whether it lay fallow or productive. Elias never saw battle, never left London, but his ink made war possible. His tables, checked and rechecked, gave shape to an empire. He lived and died in obscurity. But the world he maintained, quietly, efficiently, boringly persisted through famine, plague, and rebellion. Unresolved thought, so here's the thought to carry forward. If Elias had fallen ill, if just 1 year's records had failed, if one shipment had gone unaccounted for, could an entire campaign have collapsed? What happens to history when its most boring foundations, ledgers, rolls, grain counts, go just slightly wrong? And how many quiet figures like Elias have shaped the fates of kings, only to be buried under layers of dust, ink, and silence? The year was 1301. You return now to the same low chamber beneath Westminster, the walls damp, the torches low, and the smell of musty parchment thicker than ever. The rolls are stacked higher. The inkpots were more frequently refilled, but something else hangs in the air now. Not just wax smoke or candle soot, something more uneasy, because the numbers have begun not to add up. Elias de Wareham, now in his early 40s, is still at his desk, still hunched, still methodical, still scribbling annotations in his precise, blocky script. Is furrowed more often now. His hand pauses more frequently over the column of tallies. A discrepancy here. An entry was altered there. A manor that once paid 17 shillings last year now pays 9 and. No explanation is attached. Something is changing. And for the first time, Elias begins to realize that even the dull stability of record-keeping has its breaking point. A kingdom strains Edward I is growing older and more desperate for funds. His Scottish wars drag on, stubbornly unresolved. The great stone castles he commissioned along the Welsh border cost more than expected. His court, increasingly mobile and expensive, requires endless provisioning. To meet these needs, taxes increase on wool, on land, on merchants, and on the church. But the more you squeeze, the less comes out. And as Elias scans the parchment in front of him, he realizes something terrifyingly ordinary. The kingdom's people are starting to lie. Fraud, quiet and patient at first. It's subtle. A tax collector from Norfolk omits a village from his report claiming flood damage, but no record of flooding exists. A steward in Wiltshire pays his quota in coin clipped so thin that it's nearly useless. When Elias questions it, the steward shrugs. It spends well enough down there. Tyre abbeys begin to adjust their sheep counts. Millers underreport grain. Shire courts delay fines owed to the crown. Each case is small, almost boring. But Elias sees the pattern because Elias is watching everything. The ledgers are no longer reflecting the land. They're reflecting fear, exhaustion, and quiet resistance. When record-keeping becomes resistance, this is not open rebellion. No one is shouting in the streets. No swords are drawn. But in a kingdom ruled by documentation, silence and omission are forms of revolt. Elias understands the danger. The exchequer cannot force obedience. It can only track it. The more inaccurate the records become, the more unstable the system. Bad numbers lead to bad planning, military campaigns underfunded, royal debts mounting, and famine preparations delayed. But what can a clerk do? He raises concerns, sends notations, flags suspicious entries. Sometimes a local official is summoned. Sometimes nothing happens. More often nothing changes. Because above Elias sits a fragile chain of authority. Those above him, in times of hardship, prefer optimism to accuracy. The winter of 1301 then, that winter, comes a freeze. It arrives early. Frost blankets the south in October. The Thames ices over, wheat fails in the ground. Firewood prices soar. Elias sees it reflected in the numbers. Expected grain deliveries fail to appear. Monasteries begin defaulting on their wool quotas. Roads go unmaintained because no one has the labor or funds to repair them. A single entry from Sussex reads, "All carts frozen, 2 oxen are dead, no delivery possible." Elias stares at that line for a long time. He begins writing smaller, tighter, and more urgently. His margins fill with warnings. Trend unsustainable. Revenue not equal. To projection, recommend emergency audit. Atiza clerk. His words must pass upward through supervisors, ministers, and ultimately to the king's treasurer. And they do. But then they stop. A meeting that never happened one morning in late January, Elias is summoned to meet a royal counselor. Message is brief. The topic, irregularities in the rolls. He gathers his materials. He washes his ink-stained hands. Dresses with care his best robe. Recently brushed. He waits outside the chamber for nearly 2 hours, and then a page emerges and says, "The meeting is postponed indefinitely. No explanation, no follow-up." Elias is not fired. He is not punished, but he is ignored. Weight of a tally stick that evening, Elias returns to his shared room. Carefully unwrapping a pair of tally sticks he had kept from years prior, one from the year the Shkakara ran smoothly, and one from the recent troubled assessments. He places them side by side. The old one is precise and clean, its cut spaced with uniformity. The new one is jagged. A few notches shaved thin to avoid scrutiny. Others are freshly cut in haste. It is, in Ilias's eyes, the visible manifestation of a kingdom straining at its seams, not torn yet, but bending. He does not sleep well that night. Letters never sent over the next few weeks, Elias begins composing a letter, not to a superior, but to posterity, to the future. It is long, careful, and unflinching. He describes the breakdown of the rolls, the soft rebellion of the ledgers, and the way truth is quietly edited out when no one wishes to face it. He hides the letter behind a loose stone in the treasury's wall, sealed in oilcloth, marked only with his initials. He doesn't know if anyone will ever read it, but he needs it to exist. Because the records are beginning to land, someone must remember what they once meant. Bureaucracy on the brink by spring, Elias finds himself doing less checking and more copying. He no longer annotates questionable entries. He is told by a superior, "We must present stability." The exchequer becomes a theater. The rolls become fiction, numbers penciled to please. And behind each smooth report lies the question, who is starving to make this look balanced? It is the slow death of accountability. And Elias, for the first time in 2 decades, contemplates, leaving unresolved thought. But if he leaves, what then? Who checks the books? Who records the truth? Who ensures that at least one tally stick remains honest? And if a clerk can no longer believe in the work he does the kingdom even still exist in the form it once did? By the summer of 1303, Wareham had spent over 20 years beneath the stone vaults of the English exchequer. He still walked the same path each morning from his shared lodgings to the Westminster Treasury, still passed beneath the same soot-darkened arch, still lowered himself slowly to his familiar seat at the long oaken bench where the rolls were. Sordid, but the chamber had changed. So many of the old clerks were gone, now retired, moved on, or dead from cold, infection, or, more often, exhaustion. In their place sat younger men, bright-eyed and eager to please, far more concerned with neat ledgers than accurate ones. They knew the preferred answers. They filled columns quickly. They asked a few questions, and Elias, he had become a curiosity. An old reed sticking up from a stream that now moved too fast around him. Its collapse in the margins, the warning signs, had become undeniable. Whole regions reported sharply lower yields officially due to bad weather. But Elias saw the truth. Overgrazed pastures, soil worked to exhaustion, and peasants fleeing into forests to escape taxes. Burrows that once turned in rolls with tidy seals now submitted patchwork scrolls, written in different hands. Debts were forgiven in exchange for bribes. Even sheriffs began defaulting on their payments to the crown. The numbers were still written down, but they no longer described reality. They wore a mask. And everyone from the lowest clerk to the king's chamber was pretending not to see. Elias's quiet protest, Elias could not stop the collapse. He was a single man with a pen in a room that no longer wanted truth. But he could, at the very least, make sure someone somewhere understood what had happened. So he began a new ledger. It's not an official one. He kept it hidden beneath the bench, bound in soft hide. It contained no totals, no royal seals. Just brief entries, scribbled each day at dusk. County of York returns rolls 3 months late. No reprimand issued. Tally stick pair mismatched. Approved anyway. Lord R submits no wool count. Payment accepted regardless. 2 new clerks admit they have never seen a true audit. Each line was a whisper of rot. This private book would never be presented to the king, would never be archived. But it was, perhaps, the only accurate account of the kingdom's economic unraveling. A death at the desk, Elias died at his bench. It was late November, during a rare lull in activity. The wind whistled faintly through cracks in the old stone. A small hearth sputtered nearby. He had just finished copying a roll from Gloucester's handwriting, as always, neat and methodical. He paused, put down his quill, and then slumped forward onto the parchment. He was discovered hours later by a young clerk, who at first thought him asleep. When touched, Elias did not move. His ink-stained hand still rested on the final line. Returns incomplete. See annotations? He was buried in a modest grave in the cloister yard, beside a row of other exchequermen who had served the crown more faithfully than anyone ever noticed. His name was not entered into the rolls of notable civil servants. The court continued its business the next morning as though nothing had changed. But something had. The ledger that remained decades later, in 1350. As England reeled from the Black Death and the old institutions of power struggled to assert themselves, a minor monk copying exchequer records came across a curious bundle tucked behind a stone in the archive wall. It contained the private ledger of Elias de Wareham. The monk read it with growing astonishment. It told not of taxes collected, but of truths ignored, of silent fraud, of careful lies, of a system hollowed out while everyone smiled and wrote down pleasing numbers. The monk made no public announcement, but he copied portions into his own commentary. He referred to Elias only as the faithful clerk. From there, the story passed in whispers. Historians of later centuries would debate whether Elias truly foresaw the collapse of royal finance that followed in the 1320s, when King Edward II was forced to rely on loans from Italian bankers, when counties openly refused to pay, and when royal campaigns ground to a halt for lack of grain and horses. But those who read his notes understood he hadn't predicted disaster. He had documented it, one ledger line at a time. The bureaucrat, as witness, it's easy to overlook the role of the bureaucrat in history. They are rarely quoted, rarely celebrated, and rarely blamed. But they are the mirrors of the state. When the numbers go wrong, it means something beneath them has already broken. Elias saw the breaking. He tried quietly to slow it. When that failed, he simply wrote the truth down because that, more than anything, was his job. Not obedience, but accuracy. the lessons in dust, and here we are now, hundreds of years later, still learning from a man whose life was ruled by ledgers, tally sticks, and candlelight. He never held office, never gave speeches, never stood on a battlefield. But he preserved the truth long enough for someone else to find it. And that, perhaps, is a legacy more lasting than any king's. Final reflection, so the next time you imagine the Middle Ages, don't picture only the knight or the king. Picture the clerk, bent over his parchment, correcting someone else's numbers in silence. And ask yourself, what holds an empire together, longer iron and law, or ink and patience?
Word count.
Approximately 1,800. You've heard of the Battle of Agincourt the Mud? The arrows, the narrow field soaked with blood. You've likely heard of King Henry V, the speeches, the glory, and the odds overcome. But you may not have heard of Thomas Leake. He wasn't a knight. He never lifted a sword. He was a baker. And without him and dozens like him, the Battle of Agincourt might never have happened at all. A war runs on bread. It was October 1415, and the English army was exhausted. They had landed in France weeks before, besieged the port town of Harfleur, and lost more men to dysentery than to French arrows. While they were marching across the French countryside in an ill-advised attempt to reach Calais with dwindling supplies, and an increasingly angry French army shadowing them. You know the famous part of the story, the victory at Agincourt against all odds. But how did the English army keep moving? Bread, stale, coarse, barely risen bread. Every soldier received a daily ration called a biscuit or bisque that was nothing like the fluffy rolls of a modern bakery. These were rock-hard lumps, baked multiple times until nearly indestructible. To withstand weeks of travel and damp conditions, and to make them, the army employed a small army of bakers. Camp followers and army bakers. Thomas Leake had been baking for armies since he was 19. He wasn't enlisted. He wasn't paid as a soldier. He was what they called a camp follower, civilian who followed the army to provide essential services. Blacksmithing, scavenging, and yes, baking. He had no tent, no horse, and no weapon. His tools were more precious: a portable clay oven, thick wooden paddles, sacks of barley flour, and jars of sour leavening starter he guarded as carefully as a knight guards his sword. He traveled not with the fighting men, but with the baggage. Train hours behind the front line, trudging through churned mud and rain, with carts pulled by grumbling oxen. By the time the English army reached the village of Masonzels, the day before the battle, Thomas was half-starved himself. He had been baking for 12 hours a day, using what little flour remained to prepare enough bread to feed an army that had not eaten properly in days. Improvised ovens and hearthlight at Masonzels, the bakers were ordered to set up camp in a ruined barn. The roof had collapsed long ago, and the wind cut through the broken beams. But there was a half-standing chimney and enough dry stone to build temporary ovens called clamps low, domed structures that could retain heat even after the fire was removed. Thomas and 3 other bakers worked by firelight, mixing flour with water, forming dough with frozen fingers, slapping loaves against the oven walls, and rotating them in and out with long, splintered paddles. Every few hours they would pause, to let the ovens cool, then sweep out the ash and start the process again. It was slow, monotonous, and deeply uncomfortable work, but the soldiers were watching, as hungry men always watch the ovens. Thomas remembered one boy, a bowman no older than 16, offering to help stoke the fire just for a crust. He gave the lad half a scorched heel. The boy devoured it like meat. Flour, water, and bribes. There was never enough flour. But what was provided by the crown had long since run out. The bakers were mixing in ground peas, millet, and even dried roots. Anything that could be milled down and not poison a man. Salt was a rare treasure, too valuable to be wasted on bread. Sometimes the loaves tasted of the firewood more than the grain. But soldiers didn't complain. They lined up at dawn and dusk, holding out hands blackened by bowstring and mud. The bakers became powerful in their own quiet way. A few extra biscuits could mean the difference between strength and collapse. Some men offered coins, others offered favors, few offered threats. But Thomas always gave his extras to the wounded first. "An archer can skip a meal," he would say. "A man with a fever cannot." The night before, the camp before Agincourt was strangely silent. It had rained all day, turning the fields to soup. The soldiers huddled in their cloaks. Fires were kept small to avoid smoke. No one wanted to give the French scouts more information than necessary. That evening, King Henry himself walked the lines, speaking softly to his men. In the Barnturn bakery, Thomas and the others baked the final batch of loaves. The ovens glowed orange. Steam curled from the cracks. Soldiers appeared one by one, murmuring thanks as they took their portions. No fanfare. No rallying cries. Just quiet chewing and the sounds of tired feet trudging through wet grass. It wasn't glory. It was survival. And survival in war is half the battle. The routine of resilience, you might imagine that war is made of charges and flags and banners snapping in the wind. But war, especially medieval war, is made mostly of repetition. Stoke the fire, mix the dough, knead until your arms burn, shape it. The loaf, bake, cool. Repeat. For Thomas Leake, this rhythm was a form of endurance. His ancestors had baked for peasants and parishes. He baked for armies. He didn't believe in glory. He believed in warmth, in flour well risen, and in the dignity of feeding men who might not live to see another sunrise. The forgotten quartermaster, the Battle of Agincourt, was won by longbows, narrow terrain, and clever strategy. But it was also won by the fact that the English soldiers, though weary and sick, were not starving. They had eaten just enough to stand. And that was because men like Thomas had baked in the rain, kneaded in the cold, and carried loaves through mud just so the archers could draw their strings. His name appears nowhere in the records. There is no memorial to the bakers of Agincourt. But if you walked into an English village 100 years later and said the name Leake, you might hear, "Ah, the baker line, they kept the bread hot at Agincourt." A small legacy, but a real one. An unfinished loaf as dawn broke over the battlefield. Thomas placed his last loaf on a cloth beside the oven. He meant to eat it later. But the battle began before he could return. That loaf was never eaten. Sat cooling on a stone, then hardened, then crumbled. Much like history's memory of those who baked before the swords clashed. Ending thought, so the next time you read of battles, of charges and speeches and banners flying, ... pause and remember. The baker hunched beside a field, mixing dough with hands that smelled of smoke and salt. Working through the night, not for glory, but so the men with swords could stand upright when morning came. The morning of October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's day broke with mist and clinging mud. In the woods near Mausencel's, French knights fastened armor. Their horses stamped the frozen ground. They believed they had won already, outnumbering the English 3 or 4 to 1. A few miles away, near the same ruined barn, Thomas Leake sat by a cold oven, watching steam rise off the field. His hands were red from flour, soot, and the ache of sleepless nights. He had no sword, no armor, but he had done his part. Now he would watch what came next. A world split by foot and horse. To understand how people like Thomas fit into the medieval war machine, you must understand how these armies were built. In 1415, an English army was not a uniform, centralized force. It was a patchwork lords. Knights, footmen, and archers, each bringing their own retainers, their own gear, their own food. Or, more accurately, hoping someone else would bring it for them. There were official provisions from the king's stores barges carrying sacks of grain and dried meat. But war is unpredictable. Supplies were delayed. Roads were flooded. Were empty. That's when men like Thomas became the silent lifeline of the army. While the knights sharpened swords, the bakers stoked their fires. The clamp oven, feeding the hungry line. The simple field oven called a clamp was an essential but overlooked piece of military infrastructure. Built from brick or hardened clay, sometimes even turf, it was designed to trap and radiate heat. Soldiers might not remember who fired the first arrow, but they remembered the warmth of bread pulled from these ovens. Thomas had built his oven with broken stones and scraps of timber. It took 2 hours to heat and half an hour to bake a bat, usually about a dozen loaves at a time. During battle, the clamp was silent, but after, it became the center of recovery. Soldiers stumbled back, bloody, limping. Wide Dand sat near the baker's fire, eating quietly, not speaking of what they had seen. Agincourt begins when the sun rose over the battlefield. Thomas could hear the murmur of orders, the creak of yew-boughs being strung, the metallic clatter of men dressing for war. He knew better than to get close. Instead, he climbed a small rise behind the barn and watched from a distance. The English were lined up on a narrow strip of high ground, facing a sea of French banners. Between them lay open farmland, now sodden with rain. Mud churned under every step. The ground had become a trap. Thomas saw the French knights ride forward and get stuck. The English archers unleashed their fury volleys of arrows darkening the sky. The sound was not a great roar, but a rhythm. T-H-H-M-P. 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 Like a drum beat. Each strike sending death from 100 yards away. The battle lasted only hours. The French charge broke apart. Horses fell. Men drowned in their own armor. And when it ended, thousands of French nobles lay dead. The English had won, but it didn't feel like victory to Thomas. It felt like surviving a storm. Bread for the wounded after the fighting, the field was eerily quiet, except for the moans of the wounded. There were no organized medics, no field hospitals. Instead, wounded men were dragged behind trees or into the barn itself, where blankets were laid and old wounds reopened just to keep men alive. Thomas brought bread. It wasn't much, just crusts and ends, blackened in spots, stiff in others. But the soldiers ate. They chewed through pain, gripped his hands with bandaged fingers, and said nothing at all. Ate bread gave them something. To do, something to hold. Something warm in a world that had turned cold. A loaf and a story in one corner of the barn. A French prisoner sat cross-legged, his gauntlet still on one hand. A young English archer had dragged him in and left him there. He was barely conscious. Thomas brought him a piece of bread. The man looked at it as though it were a trick. Then he took it, slowly, as if recalling a memory. He chewed without expression. Later, through broken English, he said he had once been a cook's assistant in Paris. He had baked in the service of a noble family. He described cinnamon pastries and honeyed buns, things Thomas had never tasted. They sat in silence, bound by flour. In war, a loaf of bread was more than food. It was a shared language. The baker's role after the battle, victory meant little. Rest. The English army had to move again, but many were too weak to march. The dysentery that had plagued them at Harfleur returned with a vengeance. Men collapsed mid-step. Bodies were left where they fell. Bakers were ordered to stay with the wounded. Thomas remained behind with a handful of others, baking from scavenged supplies, grain taken from French farms, and firewood from broken wagons. The bread was worse now, barely cooked, gritty, and sometimes burned. But it was food. One sick man told Thomas, "Your bread tastes like iron and ash. But it's mine, and I'll eat it." Thomas smiled. "That's the best review I've had all week." The king's account books after the battle, clerks began to tally what had been spent. You may imagine gold and jewels and royal salaries. But the vast majority of money went to things like carts, wheel grease, horse fodder, and flour. In the surviving records from Henry V's campaign, dozens of entries refer to bread. Issued, loaves allocated, or biscuit provided by local bakers. None mention Thomas by name. But he was there in the ledger's shadows and the flour-stained margins. Without those entries, there would have been no army left to record. A soldier's memory years later, when the war was long over. An old English soldier, one who had marched at Harfleur and fought at Agincourt, was interviewed by a monk chronicling the campaign. He spoke not of the king's speech or the fall of the French, but of the morning after the battle. He said, "I remember the bread. I was starving. There was this crust, still warm, handed to me by a man in a wool cap. Don't remember his face, but the bread tasted like life." The monk didn't write down the baker's name. He simply noted, "The common men remember bread more than banners." Ending thought in history, we often remember the shouts and steel of battle. But war is also silence, waiting, smoke rising from small fires, the press of hunger. the sound of a wooden paddle pulling loaves from a stone oven. It's in those quiet, smoke-lit spaces that real endurance is forged. So what becomes of the men who do not fight but feed, who stands in the mud, elbows deep, in dew, shaping survival with their hands? Do we remember them? Or does history only remember the sword? We wouldn't find his name in the royal rolls, not in the triumphal letters sent home to England, nor in the poems praising Henry V's miraculous victory. Thomas Leake the baker near the barn was one of hundreds of camp followers whose work supported an army from behind the scenes. But while history rarely records their names, it cannot escape the footprints they left behind. Of our story, we examine what became of the forgotten bakers after Agincourt, and why their quiet legacy remains baked into the very bones of history. The ghost of the field oven. By the time winter crept over northern France, the army had moved on. The barn near Mason's cells was left behind, its beams broken, its roof sagging under rain. And Thomas. He lingered a few weeks longer, ordered to stay behind and help with the last shipment of bread to the garrison at Calais. He rebuilt the oven one final time, not with any expectation of thanks, but out of habit. For a baker, the instinct to heat, clay and shaped dough never quite leaves the hands. The rhythm of kneading, proofing, and turning loaves was a comfort even amid the ruins. He left the oven standing. And centuries later, during a 19th century excavation of the Agincourt battlefield, a strange circular depression of scorched earth was discovered near the remains of a timber structure. The archaeologists debated its purpose. A forge? A burial fire? But a local historian, familiar with medieval army logistics, quietly labeled it in his notes. Camp oven, just a small detail. Forgotten flame. But someone had once fed 100 men there. The women who baked too, while Thomas represents a male baker. Many of those responsible for provisioning armies, especially during long campaigns, were women. Military records from the 100 Years' War reveal something strange. In nearly every muster roll, there are names listed under servants or followers who were, in fact, not directly tied to any knight or soldier. Many were widows, camp cooks, worshippers, and yes, bakers. Some followed their husbands. Others worked for coin. A few had even run village ovens before being conscripted willingly or not to army life. They baked flatbread on upturned shields, kosh cakes on the side of trench walls. They dried biscuit rations in low fires, turning loaves into something hard enough to last a month and harder still to chew. Some were paid, many were not. But their labor made the king's victories possible. When historians flip through the dusty rolls of the Calais garrison years later, they occasionally pause at odd names. Marjorie Cook, Agnes of the Oven, Bella the Crumb Giver. These are not poetic titles. They were real women. Their identity was baked into their task. Hardtack and the preservation of pain, much of the bread that fed medieval armies, wasn't soft or warm. It was hardtack, a biscuit baked twice or more. Until nearly fossilized, think of it as the iron ration of the Middle Ages. Dry, nearly flavorless, and nearly indestructible. When Thomas left Agincourt and eventually returned to England, he took with him one last sealed box of hardtack loaves. It wasn't sentimentality, it was policy. Every returning ship from Calais to Dover was ordered to bring back what could still be used. A king's war budget was tight, but hardtack was returned to the king's stores in London. One piece. Survived into a museum collection, cracked, grayish, wrapped in old wax cloth, and labeled simply, bread, from campaign of King Harry V. A curator once tapped it gently with a pencil. Sounds like a stone, he said. But inside that biscuit was the ghost of an oven fire, the echo of Thomas's work. Not everything baked is meant to be eaten. Some things are meant to endure. Life after Agincourt. When the army dispersed, Thomas went back to London, where he found work near the Shambles Street, famous for its blood-soaked butchers and smoke-filled bakehouses. He never owned a shop, worked in the back, often sleeping. In the storage loft where flour dust collected on rafters like snow, his hands remained cracked from heat and lie. Never married. Some said the things he'd seen had changed him. He rarely spoke of France, but when he did, he spoke not of war, but of baking in the mud. There's a story unconfirmed but past. Down among bakers near Holborn, that Thomas once baked a loaf in the shape of a helmet, placed it in the shop window on St. Crispin's Day, and sat watching the rain fall as customers passed it by. He sold it at day's end for a farthing. A cheap crust. A rich memory. History written in Crumb's medieval chronicles are filled with knights, kings, sieges, and saints. But in the margins, you'll sometimes find scribbled notes from monastic. Scribes' notes about food. 2 loaves short this week. Baked crust burned gave to pigs. Brother Martin accused of hoarding flour. These scraps revealed the daily rhythms of medieval life. And in one 15th century collection, tucked inside a ledger from an abbey that briefly hosted English soldiers after Agincourt, there is this entry: bread for 20, prepared by a man from London who had baked for the king's army. He requested no coin, only salt. Said he missed the fire. Perhaps it was Thomas, or someone like him, a baker who had learned that war burns more than flesh, burns into memory, and bread, even bad bread, is a way to remember. The hidden infrastructure of victory. Military historians have long debated how the English won at Agincourt. The longbow, the mud, the narrow field. But recently, more scholars are focusing on logistics, the infrastructure behind the scenes, the wagons, the carpenters, the farriers, and yes, the bakers. One paper, published quietly in an academic journal, argued that the miracle of Agincourt was less about divine favor and more about the remarkable cohesion of the supply system, including consistent bread provisioning, even in hostile territory. It's a dry argument, but that's the point. History isn't always shaped by the blade. Sometimes it's shaped by what was placed on a wooden paddle at 4 a.m., pulled from the flame and passed into the hands of a trembling man who hadn't. Eaten in 2 days? Final reflection, so here we are at the end of our story. Thomas Leake may have been forgotten by kings, but his work left no fewer ripples than the swords that clashed on that muddy French field. Bread is transient. It grows stale. It's eaten and forgotten. But the act of baking, the intention behind it, is an echo through time. In every war, there are those who fire arrows, and those who fire ovens. So next time you bite into a crust of bread, imagine who lit the fire, shaped the dough in silence, and who waited in the shadows of history, giving warmth to a world that was burning. You lie in your bed, listening to the patter of rain on the shingles, and think to yourself, it must be near dawn. Streets outside are quiet. The city sleeps, or at least tries to, under a veil of wood smoke, fog, and the ever-present stink of refuse. But beneath your floorboards, someone is moving. He is quiet, efficient, and he smells worse than anything you've ever imagined. Is a night soil man, one of thousands in early modern London who spent their nights crawling into privy pits, hauling out human waste and carting it away in barrels, one stinking shovel at a time. You probably don't know his name, but you lived your entire life atop his work. The shadow workforce, in the grand histories of Elizabethan London, you'll hear about the Globe Theatre, the bustling docks, the spice merchants, and the silken intrigue of court. But almost nothing is said of the city's waste, the unrelenting daily tide of it, and even less about the people who moved it. By 1600, London's population had exploded to over 200,000. With that came a problem no playwright dared script: human waste, lots of it. To deal with the buildup, the city relied on night soil collectors, so called because they worked only after dark, moved quietly, with lanterns shaded, often barefoot or in soft shoes to avoid waking households. Their job? To empty the cesspits beneath London's privies and cart the waste night soil out of the city. It was a job no one respected and everyone depended on. The architecture of filth, you may imagine a medieval or Tudor toilet as a hole in the ground. That's not entirely wrong, but the reality was more complex and more hazardous. Most urban homes, especially in growing districts like Southwark or Cheapside, had wooden privies built over a pit. These cesspits could be lined with stone or brick if the owner had money. But more often they were just soil-lined and would gradually soak through. Some homes shared a pit between them, accessed by a narrow back alley, Once full, these pits had to be emptied manually. A team of night soil men would climb into the pit, sometimes up to their chests in filth, and shovel the contents into buckets. These were passed up to another man who emptied them into barrels or carts. The pits were often infested with rats, beetles, and worse. Gases built up inside could overwhelm a man, or even cause explosions if a lantern was lowered too quickly. Many night soil men died by suffocation, drowning in human waste, or from infections contracted in the pits. Their work was dangerous. Their pay was modest, but it was steady. And for the poorest men in the city, it offered something rare: employment. Where it all went, you might think all this waste was simply dumped into the Thames, and much of it eventually was. But there was also a surprisingly organized system for disposal. Night soil was hauled out of the city and sold as fertilizer to farmers on the outskirts of London. Entire plots of land were fed by the waste of the city's population. Fields near Hackney, Whitechapel, and Stepney were commonly used for dumping, then plowed under the following spring. It was a circular system. City to country, waste to wheat, back again as bread. There were even licensed dumping grounds outside the city walls. These had to be renewed each year by the Lord Mayor's office. Records from the period showed detailed contracts between night soil men and landowners. Imagine that. A man who spent his nights knee-deep in filth still had to navigate bureaucracy. The unseen night soil men rarely left behind personal accounts. Few could write, and fewer still were interested in preserving their legacy. Every now and then, we catch a glimpse of them in court records, city ordinances, or complaints. The stench rising from the alley of Mr. Stone's privy is unbearable, and the nightmen are no longer entering for fear of vermin. Southern complaint, 1594. A child fell into an uncovered pit near Ludgate. The man responsible was one John Taverner, a digger of soil, who fled. Coroner's report, 1601. They existed in the margins mentioned only when something went wrong. They were feared. People claimed the men brought disease, that they harbored criminal tendencies. Some even accused them of reselling waste as medicine, though this was likely exaggerated. Still, the smell clung to them. Even when washed, they carried it in their hair, under their nails, and in their clothes. One diarist described passing a man in the street and being unable to eat for hours afterward. Night soil men walked invisible among the living, until they didn't. A day in the life at night. So what did the average night look like for someone in this line of work? Let's imagine a man named Will. He is 37. He owns his shovel, his rope, his buckets, and a small cart pulled by a mule. His father did this work before him. His older brother died from a fall into an uncovered pit. Will has a wife who boils his clothes in vinegar and ash after every shift. They live on the edge of Smithfield. Will begins his work at sunset, visiting 3 houses in St. Mary's Ward. Each has a cesspit that hasn't been emptied in 6 months. One of them is nearly overflowing. He removes the planks carefully, lights a lantern, and descends with a hooked rope tied to his waist. The smell is unbearable. He hums to distract himself. It takes him over an hour to empty the first pit. By the second, he is sweating despite the cold. His arms ache. By the third, his fingers are numb. He cuts them on a shard of glass in the waste. He mutters something under his breath. He leaves the alley by dawn, his cart creaking under the weight. The barrels will be dumped at a farm by Epping Forest. He is paid for pennies, buys bread, cheese, and onions from a vendor. He eats in silence. Then he sleeps until dusk. That is his life, not glorious, but vital. Ending with a stench by the end of the Elizabethan era, the job of night soil. Men became more regulated. Guilds formed. Territories reclaimed. Conflicts arose between teams of collectors. Fines were issued for dumping too close to wells. But the job remained what it always was: dangerous, filthy, and invisible. You walk the streets of modern London and think of Shakespeare, of plague, of grandeur, and empire. You rarely think of what lies beneath. But for every house built in that era, there was a pit, and for every pit, a man had to climb inside. So we end this first section with a simple question: how many lives were saved because one man was willing to wade into the filth so others could live above it in comfort. You are walking now, not in the narrow alleys of London's night, but in the crowded courtrooms and guild halls by day. By candlelight, ink dries on city records, decisions are made, complaints are logged, contracts exchanged. All of it, swirling. Around one of the city's least glamorous but most essential trades, the collection of human waste. In the previous section, we met the night soilmen, those unsung scavengers who operated under cover of darkness. But their work didn't happen in a vacuum. Behind them stood a delicate system of laws, licenses, landowners, and loopholes. And as London grew, so did the tensions over who controlled the filth. City ordinances and royal edicts London didn't become the city it was by ignoring its problems. It simply buried them, sometimes literally. By the mid-16th century, the rising population meant more waste, more pits, and more risk of disease. The Lord Mayor's office, tasked with managing the city's sanitation, issued a stream of ordinances to control the mounting crisis. One early regulation from 1578 reads, "No privy shall be made above the common street, nor suffered to leak onto neighbor's wall under pain of fine." Another from 1583, "That all night carts bearing the dung of houses shall be covered, and drawn only at hours approved by the ward constable." The language was stiff and formal, but the reality was messier. Enforcement varied wildly. Some neighborhoods had active wardens who monitored privies and waste pits. Others were neglected. For years, bribes were common. It was not unusual for wealthier residents to tip officials to ignore illegal dumping on their property. In theory, every cesspit required a license to build, maintain, and empty. In practice, most were ignored until they overflowed. Guilds. Turf wars and cart traffic. Though night soilmen were typically poor, their work did not go unregulated. Over time, they began organizing into informal teams, small crews of laborers who shared tools and routes. By 1590, certain wards of London had exclusive collecting crews, informally recognized by city officials. Some were hereditary, others were backed by powerful patrons. They paid dues to operate in specific areas, and any encroachment was met with swift retaliation. Conflicts often arose when independent collectors, especially those from outside London laborers from Kent, for instance, tried to enter the city and take jobs. These foreign dungmen were viewed with deep suspicion. Court records mention street brawls between rival teams of collectors. A 1602 account from the Bridewell Sessions describes an altercation betwixt soilmen of Aldgate and those of Limehouse, involving thrown spades and overturned carts by reason of a pit being poached without leave. That is, one crew emptied a cesspit they weren't licensed to, and chaos ensued. These disputes were not just about honor, they were about livelihood. Street, each alley, and each household pit represented a week's wages. Some collectors paid rent to operate their carts in the city-on early version of a sanitation license. These fees helped fund city maintenance and road repair, though corruption meant much of the money vanished before use. Dumping grounds and disputes once collected, the night soil had to go somewhere. The most common destinations were fields on the city's outskirts. These dumping grounds had to be negotiated with landowners, who demanded compensation for the stench and inconvenience. Some were more formal. In Stepney, an old chalk pit was converted into a massive waste dumping site by the late 16th century. Local farmers complained for years, citing ruined crops and tainted wells. In 1599, the residents of Hackney petitioned Parliament, "We are beset by cartloads of filth drawn from the Bell Ward and St. Sepulchre, dumped at our gates, choking the air and spoiling our fields." But the city needed those spaces. And with nowhere else to go, the night soil kept coming. By the turn of the 17th century, dedicated night roads, little-known dirt lanes, were used solely by waste carts to move out of the city. These dung ways were often poorly maintained and prone to flooding, making the job even more treacherous. Imagine pushing a heavy barrel-laden cart through ankle-deep mud in the dark, surrounded by the hum of flies and the stink of summer heat. And yet this was normal. Class stigma and the smell of poverty being a night soil man was not just physically degrading, it carried deep social stigma. The Elizabethan world was built on hierarchy. Your profession was not just a job, it was your identity. To collect filth marked you as unclean, both literally and spiritually. Night soil men were often barred from communal gatherings. Some churches wouldn't allow them to sit in the main pews. Others had to use separate entrances. Or were quietly encouraged to worship elsewhere. Marriages between a soil man's family and even modest tradespeople, cobblers, coopers, or bakers, were rare. Their children faced bullying. Their wives struggled to sell goods in markets due to the stink. Even the language used to describe them reflects the contempt. Dirt handlers, gutter slaves, moon haulers, and stoolmen. Yet, despite this disdain, they served every household in London. This contradiction, being both despised and needed, is one of the quiet tragedies of early sanitation work. Faith and filth, it may surprise you to learn that religion played a role in how people understood sanitation. In the late 1500s, many Londoners believed disease came from miasma, bad air. This belief, rooted in ancient Greek medicine, held that rot and smell could cause plague, fever, or worse. Thus, keeping the streets clean was viewed not only as a health matter, but also as a moral duty. Sermons from the period reflect this: "Let not thy house become a den of stench, for where filth grows, Satan doth find root." Rev. Thomas Lay, 1587. Night soil men, despite their low status, were quietly acknowledged as performing godly work, preserving the health of others by removing spiritual and literal corruption. Some collectors wore religious symbols like crude wooden crosses around their necks. Others invoked saints, especially Saint Fiacca, a patron of gardeners, and often invoked for health and fertility as they worked. We do not know their prayers. But in the dark pits, surrounded by rot, perhaps some whispered pleas into the steaming silence. What happened when it failed? When night soil collection was interrupted by plague, by war, by strike, or by accident, the results were catastrophic. Blocked, cesspits overflowed, waste ran into the streets, rats flourished, wells were tainted. In 1592, during one of London's many plague years, several collectors died or refused to work. That summer, several wards went uncleaned for weeks. Mortality rates in those districts soared. The link between sanitation and health wasn't fully understood yet, but people noticed patterns. By 1600, some wealthier neighborhoods began paying extra for regular waste removal, sometimes sending servants to negotiate directly with favored collectors. But the poor could not afford such luxuries. Their streets ran black with filth, and their children bore the cost. The invisible infrastructure today, when you flush a toilet, you rarely consider the centuries of labor, suffering, and silent organization that made it possible. At every system has a beginning. The night soil men were among the first to confront the reality of a crowded city's waste. They worked in the shadows, under torchlight, through mud and rot and rain. Their tools were simple: a shovel, a bucket, and a rope. But their legacy shaped the foundation of modern sanitation. They rarely wrote. They did not leave journals or memoirs. But their presence is etched in ordinances, in coroners' reports, and in the margins of the great histories. They were London's unseen skeleton crew, keeping the city livable, one pit at a time. And so we end this second section with another question. What does it say about a society that its dirtiest job was also its most essential, and that the men who performed it were forgotten? By now, you've followed the night soil men through the alleys, into the pits, and across the city's delicate web of waste politics. You've heard the echoes of wooden wheels turning through moonlit dungways and glimpsed the unseen workers in the background of grand Elizabethan dramas. But what became of them? What legacy did they leave? To understand the strange and quiet end of the night soil era, we must peer forward into change, into reform, and into the darkness beneath the city. Because under London, even in Elizabethan times, something was growing. It's not just the waste, but the idea of a future system, an underground network, centuries in the making. Early dreams of a sewer, even in the 16th century, some thinkers imagined a cleaner city. In 1596, a courtier named Sir John Harrington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I, invented what he called the Ajax an early flush toilet. The device included a cistern and a mechanical flushing system that poured water into a bowl, was mocked by many, admired by few, and installed in exactly one place, his own house. Queen Elizabeth herself tried it once. She did not like it. The public, meanwhile, preferred their chamber pots and privies. The night soil men, after all, still came to take it away. Yet Harrington's idea lingered, even in a city built on wood. In Wattle, someone had begun thinking about pipes, about systems, about removing human waste without needing human labor. It was a thought centuries ahead of its time, but one that would eventually unravel the work of the night soil trade. The problem of depth: most cesspits were about 6 to 10 feet deep, just enough to hold a few months' waste. With bricks, others were dug straight into soil and clay. But in older parts of the city, layers built up over generations. As houses grew on top of older ones, some pits were simply sealed and forgotten. New ones were dug alongside them. By the early 1600s, parts of London sat on a multi-layered crust of refuse: dead animals, human waste, and buried privy pits. Archaeological digs today uncover strange remains: shoes, tools, bones, all entombed in compacted layers of organic matter preserved in London's anaerobic soil. And in those depths sometimes lie clues about the men who emptied them. In one dig near Bishopsgate, archaeologists found a wooden bucket with a carved M on the base, along with a set of rusted iron hooks and a pair of leather gloves. They likely belonged to a soil man forgotten in a pit, buried by centuries. Disease and death: night soil men were exposed to dangers far beyond stench and social stigma. Even before the scientific discovery of germs, people understood that waste could kill. Collectors were particularly vulnerable to typhoid, cholera, leptospirosis, dysentery, and of course the plague. During outbreaks, their work was both in higher demand and more perilous. Entire crews would vanish during major epidemics with only second-hand reports of what became of them. One grim account from 1603 records: a collector named Elias Cook found dead in a pit near Cripplegate. His body, bloated and streaked with filth, was discovered 2 days later. No one would retrieve it. Eventually the pit was sealed with lime and the house was abandoned. Some soil men made it into their old age, but not many. Few received burials in churchyards. Most were interred in pauper pits, alongside the city's poorest, often near the very dumps they worked in life. The laws began to shift by the mid-17th century. Public health reformers were pushing for change. Writers, like John Evelyn, in his famous 1661 treatise, Fumifugium, lamented the state of London's air and streets. Though Evelyn focused more on smoke than sewage, the sentiment was spreading. Something must be done. After the Great Fire of 1666, which destroyed much of central London, new building codes were introduced. These included better construction of privies, more regular inspections, and stronger penalties for illegal dumping. For the first time, the city began planning for drainage on a broader scale. But progress was slow. The night soil men remained vital well into the 18th century, clinging to the margins of a city just beginning to imagine modernity. The rural afterlife of waste, you may be wondering, what happened to all that waste? It didn't just vanish. In fact, fertilizer was one of the reasons night soil was so valuable. Farmers on the outskirts of London, especially in areas like Hackney, Deptford, and Islington, paid to have the soil delivered. Mixed with straw and composted in heaps, it provided nitrogen-rich matter that improved crop yields. In a strange way, the waste of London became the bread of England. Some farms even made private arrangements with collection crews to ensure a regular supply. Certain fields near Hounslow and Bow were reputed to grow the best cabbages thanks to the freshest soil from the Bishopsgate wards. This exchange of waste for food formed a quiet loop. The city fed the countryside, and the countryside fed the city. It's an image that lingers: a cartload of night soil rolling through dawn mist, bringing rot to nurture growth. From dung to data, the final death of the night soil trade came centuries later. With the rise of underground sewers in the 19th century, but their records remain. Thanks to the meticulous notes kept by city officials, we know how many loads were moved, how many carts were licensed, and even which crews operated in which wards. These scraps tell a human story, a tally of lives and margins, of grit and quiet labor. In 1624, a list of licensed collectors includes Thomas Winstead, cart license for Farringdon without Eleanor Bain's widow, inheritor of pit clearing rights in Milk Street Job Fry and Son, responsible for the Bread Street ward. These aren't famous names. They didn't lead armies or write plays. They kept the city alive. The smell of memory by the time flush toilets and underground plumbing took hold. Most Londoners had forgotten the night soil men. They disappeared not with a revolution, but with a quiet phase outpushed aside by pipes, tiles, and steam-pumped water systems. But if you walk certain alleys in the oldest parts of the city, if you close your eyes and imagine the stillness, before sunrise, you might still hear the soft squeak of cartwheels, the muffled grunt of effort, the echo of a bucket rising from shadowed depths. Because history isn't always marked by monuments. Sometimes it's hidden in smells and stains, in the whispered labor that no one wanted to do but someone had to. And so we leave behind the night soil Menancian but essential, buried beneath layers of history in brick and stone. They built the foundation of every modern city, not with glory, but with grime. But we end with a final question. What other forgotten hands built the world you live in, and why have we forgotten to remember them? It began not in a museum or in a dusty archive, but in a place far more ordinary, a sloping patch of land in the English countryside, pocked with weeds and wheel ruts, where sheep grazed and tractors passed without a second thought. You might not think much of a farmer's field, but beneath its quiet soil, history, waits compressed, silent, layered in secrets. This is the story of a boy named George, a weathered piece of pottery, and a Roman temple buried for 1,600 years. A boy with muddy boots. George Green was 11 years old when he first saw the edge of something strange. It was the summer of 1922, in the village of Lullingstone in Kent, southeastern England. His parents owned a modest farm tucked against the Derwent Valley, where the soil turned sticky after the rains and glinted oddly in the sun. Like many boys in the English countryside, George spent his days exploring, the stick in hand and a dog named Triggs in tow. He poked at rabbit holes, climbed hedgerows, and wandered across the old Roman road that locals simply called the Straight Track. It was during one such idle walk, while crossing the edge of the lower pasture, that George stumbled on a patch of hard stone barely showing through the earth. He knelt down, pulled away some grass, and found what looked like an uneven slab. There were faint carvings along its edge, like the edge of a picture frame, worn smooth by time. Most children would have moved on. George, for reasons unknown even to him, returned the next day with a trowel. A curious find. What George uncovered wasn't just a flat stone. It was part of a tiled floor. In the days that followed, he slowly cleared a corner about 2 feet wide out. Beneath the mud was a series of red, white, and black tiles arranged in geometric patterns. Near the edge of the clearing, he found a curved bit of pottery, half of a bowl, thick and reddish, its rim notched, with dots. When he showed it to his father, the elder Green laughed. "Bit of old junk," he said. "Best leave it be. Can't plow through mosaic." George didn't leave it be. He brought the bowl to his schoolteacher, a Mr. Hollingford, who had a modest interest in antiquities. The teacher's eyes widened when he saw it. The rim pattern was unmistakable. Late Roman, probably 4th century. Together, they returned to the site. By the end of the week, Mr. Hollingford had contacted the Society of Antiquaries in London, and within the month, a team of archaeologists arrived at the Green Farm. The quiet field would never be the same again. Unearthing a Roman world, what lay beneath the pasture was more than a tiled floor. It was a complex Roman villa from the late imperial period, sprawling across a slight slope above the river. But what surprised the archaeologists wasn't just its size. It was what lay at the center. A rectangular chamber with thick walls, a raised platform, carved fragments of a statue, incense burners, and a buried offering pit containing scorched bones and broken cups. It wasn't a kitchen, a workshop, or even a sleeping room. It was a temple, a Roman religious chamber built directly beneath the central villa building, facing east toward the rising sun. It had stood quietly, entombed in soil, since the 4th century, long after the legions left, long after the empire fell. And it had survived almost untouched. What was it doing there? You might wonder why a temple was buried beneath a farmhouse. The answer is layered in history. By the late 4th century CE, Roman Britain was in turmoil. The roads still carried trade, and Roman villas still functioned, but the political structure was weakening. Local landowners began combining spiritual and domestic life, often building shrines inside their own villas. This particular site likely belonged to a Romano-British family, descendants of both Roman settlers and native Britons, living at the edge of a declining empire. The temple beneath their villa was small but richly decorated. Mosaics depicted mythical scenes: Bellerophon slaying the chimera, Europa and the bull, and curiously, a winged figure that looked like a hybrid of a Roman god and something older, perhaps a Celtic deity reimagined through Roman lenses. At some point, the temple had been sealed. Why? That remains a mystery. Some believe it was deliberately hidden, perhaps during the rise of Christianity in late Roman Britain. Others think the villa was abandoned suddenly, and the soil simply consumed it over time. A name in the stone among the most intriguing finds was a broken stone tablet with a faint Latin inscription. It read, "Lucius Petronius, servant of the gods, dedicates this house to Silvanus." Silvanus was a Roman god of forests and boundaries. He was often worshipped by rural people, farmers, shepherds, and laborers. But here beneath a villa, a servant had carved his name and offered the space as sacred. Who was Lucius Petronius? Was he the villa owner's servant? A freedman? A rural priest? His name is common in Roman records and no further details survive. Yet his scratch in stone remains a voice from a forgotten world. Caught between empire and wilderness, city and field, Rome and Britain, the everyday villa beyond the temple, the rest of the site told a quieter story. There were cooking hearths with traces of lentils and grain, charred olive pits, broken glass goblets, a bronze pin used to fasten a cloak, dozens of iron nails from what were likely storage bins or animal pens. The bones of pigs and chickens lay in midden heaps. There were even children's toys, teeny clay figurines of horses and soldiers, worn smooth by play. This wasn't just a religious site, it was a home. The family who lived there likely spoke a mixture of Latin and local Brythonic. They would have worn a blend of Roman-style tunics and native woolen cloaks. They ate bread made from local wheat, drank watered wine, and celebrated both Saturnalia and local harvest festivals. And below it all, the temple waited. Then it was. Forgotten sometime around the early 5th century, the site was abandoned. There's no sign of fire or violence, no hordes hidden in panic, just a slow, silent end. Historians believe the family may have left as Roman authority withdrew from Britain, unable to maintain their estate without support. The villa crumbled. The walls collapsed, the tiles shifted under centuries of rain. Grass grew and sheep returned, and the boy with muddy boots found it 1,600 years later. The story of George Green and the Lulling Stone Temple is not one of emperors or armies. It's a story of quiet continuity, of one family's blend of belief, daily life, and rural resilience. It reminds us that history is not only in palaces or battlefields, but beneath the very fields we walk. But as archaeologists continued to unearth the site, they made a discovery that changed everything. In the center of the mosaic floor, hidden under a collapsed wall, was a Christian symbol, subtly inlaid. Did a Roman temple come to bear a Christian mark? And what happened to the family after Rome's fall? You might think of temples and churches as opposites, one for gods long forgotten, the other for the God who endures. But in late Roman Britain, that boundary was not so clean. When archaeologists continued work at Lulingstone in the autumn of 1922, the deeper layers of soil brought more than just offerings to Silvanus. What they found shook their understanding of how religion changed in Britain, not through violence or revolution, through quiet overlap. What the soil revealed was not a clash, but a convergence. A mosaic with two faces, the central mosaic floor of the main reception room. The triclinium was the villa's artistic centerpiece. It spanned over 15 feet, with careful red and black tesserae forming images of classical myths. Bellerophon riding Pegasus, Europa carried away by Zeus in the form of a bull. But in the corner, mostly concealed by a fallen roof tile, lay a smaller, simpler symbol, a chiro, formed with white tesserae. It was faint, deliberate, easy to miss, but unmistakable. The chiroth, overlapping Greek letters for Christ, was one of the earliest Christian symbols. It had been used as early as the 4th century CE, especially after Constantine's conversion. And here it was, tucked into a room meant for feasting and storytelling. This was not a public church. This was a private villa, and the symbol was laid beneath people's feet. Who had placed it there, and when? Christianity and Roman Britain. To understand this strange blend of gods and crosses, you need to imagine the last decades of Roman Britain, not as an empire in collapse, but as a world shifting slowly, almost imperceptibly. Christianity had been legal in the empire since the Edict of Milan in 313 CE. By the mid-4th century, bishops were appointed across Gaul, Spain, and parts of Britain. Yet rural areas often retained old beliefs. It's likely that the family who owned the Lulingstone villa were converts, or perhaps their children were. They might have honored old deities like Sylvanus, while also adopting Christian ideas, blending symbols, celebrating both Saturnalia and Easter, unsure of how to leave the old ways behind. The temple below may have once honored Sylvanus, but the room above bore the chiro. A painted wall tells a new story more surprising than the floor. Was what appeared on one of the walls during the winter dig, faded fresco fragments that, once cleaned and reassembled, it revealed an unmistakable Christian scene. It showed two standing figures, robed and haloed, holding what looked like open books or scrolls. Between them, a large chiro and a stylized cross. Above, a dove. The figures lacked labels, but scholars believe they were Christian martyrs, or perhaps apostles rendered in a simple but confident style. The art had faded, but enough color remained to see they wore purples and blues, signifying importance. This wasn't accidental. Someone had converted part of the villa into a private Christian chapel, and it had been done within a generation of the old temple's use. Family tombs and silent farewells in a side chamber, once a cellar. Then repurposed as a mausoleum, archaeologists discovered two stone coffins. Inside were the skeletal remains of a man and a woman, both buried with care, facing east hands. Folded. The woman's grave contained a silver pin and fragments of silk. The man had a simple bronze ring. No inscription survived. But they were likely the villa's final owners, or, at least, its last Christian generation. This type of burial, indoors, facing east, and without grave goods, became common in Christian households of the late 4th and early 5th centuries. It reflected a shift in belief. Death was no longer a passage to the underworld or a return to the gods, but a wait for resurrection. It also signaled that the villa was no longer just a home. It had become a place of worship and memory. Threads of daily life outside the religious chambers. Daily life continued much as it had before. One layer of ash in the kitchen hearth contained fish bones, possibly eland charred lentil pods. Analysis of residue from amphorae suggested the family still received olive oil and wine from Gaul. A loom weight found in the corner of a collapsed room told of weaving. Nearby, a comb made from antler and a pair of bronze tweezers hinted at grooming habits. There was also a writing style as a thin iron tool used to scratch letters into wax tablets. This villa was not a forgotten outpost. It was connected, educated, and aware of the shifting tides of belief and empire, and then they left. Sometime between 410 and 430 CE, the site was abandoned. The final layer of occupation showed signs of wear: collapsed tiles, rotted timber, and increasing dampness. A few broken jars lay near the entrance, and one of the mosaics had been roughly pried apart as though someone had hoped to reuse the materials or hide them. There was no fire, no sign of attack. It was not a dramatic end, but a gradual unraveling. The Roman administration had pulled out, trade slowed, local economies shifted. The family wealthy enough to build a chapel in their villa have moved to a safer town or simply died out. By the end of the 5th century, the Temple of Silvanus and the Christian chapel above it were buried under silt and grass, and the land returned to sheep and silence. The farmers returned for nearly 1,500 years. The villa site lay dormant. The farmer's plow occasionally struck stone, but nothing ever emerged. Locals told vague stories of old Roman bits in the soil, but none knew the truth. The Darent River changed course slightly. Fields were divided, rented, and then bought back again. When George Green walked across that pasture in 1922, he unknowingly stepped into 3 layers of belief: rural Roman religion, early Christianity, and a modern secular world that had forgotten both. And when he poked the soil with a stick, he did what no archaeologist or bishop had done. He connected those layers. He brought the temple back to the light. A heritage quietly preserved today, the Lullingstone Villa site is preserved as a museum. You can walk the same tiled floor George once uncovered. The frescoes are reconstructed, the coffins reassembled behind glass. Tourists come quietly. There are no great battles retold here, no kings or queens, just a family's house, their shift. From Silvanus to Christ, and a boy who listened to what the soil had to say. In the end, the villa speaks to how slowly beliefs change, not through sudden conversion, but through centuries of overlap. Gods do not fall all at once. They fade, then blend, then remain beneath our feet, waiting. But one final question lingers. Why did that family choose to hide the temple below? Was it out of reverence, or guilt, or simply because old beliefs die hard? The stones do not speak, but they remember. Long after the villa at Lullingstone was left to rot, long after the empire had retreated from Britain, even the roads began to crumble. The site retained something more potent than ruins. It held a memory, quietly pressed between layers of dirt and ash. A memory of lives lived. At the edge of 2 worlds, the old gods of the forest and the new faith of the cross. In this final chapter, we step further into the wine, just what was found, but what it means that it was found at all. Because in the sleepy soil of Kent, what was uncovered was not just a Roman villa, but a quiet testimony to how belief survives and slips into the future. After the empire, by the mid-5th century, Roman Britain was no longer Roman in anything but fading habit. The legions had been gone for decades. Local warlords filled the gaps left behind. Villas, once signs of elite Roman culture, were too expensive to maintain. Most fell into disrepair. A few were fortified. Others became farms again, stripped of tile and marble, turned into sheep pens and chicken coops. Lullingstone was no exception. Its once impressive frescoes cracked with frost. Roof beams collapsed inward. Weeds sprouted in mosaic crevices. The cellar that once held bodies slowly filled with rainwater, then silt. There are no records of who came next. No early Saxon settlers wrote down what they thought of the crumbling villa. Perhaps they avoided it. Perhaps they plundered it for bricks. Or perhaps, sensing something sacred still lingering, they let it rest. The site became just another hillock in a field. Cows grazed, trees grew, soil shifted. And still, the mosaics lay there intact, waiting. A quiet rediscovery, the 20th century, brought new curiosities. After George Green's initial discovery, and the work of local archaeologists in the 1920s, attention to the site waned. Britain had other things on its mind: the Great Depression and World War II. Interest in provincial Roman villas was not exactly urgent. But in 1949, more extensive excavation resumed. This time, led by professionals with better tools and a stronger sense of preservation. What they uncovered went far beyond a villa floor. They found layers. One room had been repurposed 3 times. A wine cellar turned mausoleum, turned storage space. A reception hall turned chapel, turned ruin. The deeper they dug, the more blurred the lines became between sacred and domestic. A child's toy was found near a wall plastered with Christian imagery. Kitchen refuse was piled near what may have once been a baptismal font. Lullingstone was not a house or a church. It was both, and that, in its own slow way, made it extraordinary. The temple below the foundations beneath the main building, believed to be part of a detached structure or shrine, were not part of the original villa. They came earlier. Dating from the 2nd or 3rd century CE, the subterranean chamber had curved walls, suggesting a rounded apse, and post holes for a wooden superstructure. At its center, a shallow pit, likely used for offerings. Burnt animal bones, pottery fragments, and traces of red ochre were found within. This wasn't a grand temple. It was rural, intimate. More like a household shrine made formal a place, where farmers might have asked Sylvanus to keep wolves from the flock or ensure the wheat didn't mold in spring. Later, when the villa expanded, the temple was buried, destroyed, just sealed, covered with stone, then built over, left intact beneath new walls and new prayers. Why? Perhaps the owners had converted. Perhaps they feared the old rites, but dared not defile them. Perhaps they simply saw no contradiction. One god below, another above, and both worth keeping close. In a way, it mirrored what was happening across Britain. The gods weren't overthrown, they were absorbed. A personal faith. There's something deeply human about how Christianity arrived at Lullingstone. It wasn't imposed by an army or decreed from a pulpit. It seeped in through art and habit. It appeared first as a symbol on a floor, then as a fresco on a wall, then in the silence of two buried bodies facing the dawn. There were no grand cathedrals, no relics, no sermons etched in stone, only gestures. A painted dove, a stylus in a drawer, a cross tucked into a corner. Historians call this a Domus Ecclesia house church. It was how Christianity first thrived, not in grand basilicas, but in private homes, side chambers, and over modest meals. The villa's conversion wasn't dramatic. It was personal. It suggests that the owners weren't just Christians. In name, they rearranged their home, their routines, and even their burial plans. They didn't abandon their culture. They adapted it. That quiet conversion may be the most overlooked kind of revolution, one that happens at the dinner table, not the battlefield. Christianity's strange survival, what makes Lullingstone so compelling, is that it's one of only a handful of early Christian sites from Roman Britain. There is no known list of churches. No British bishops were at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Yet clearly, the faith had reached private homes and villa estates. The absence of written evidence makes the villa even more valuable. It offers a rare glimpse into pre-Saxon Christianity before Augustine's mission to Canterbury in 597 CE, before monasteries dotted the landscape. For a time, Christianity flourished, quietly in villas like this. And then, just as quietly, it vanished. When the Saxons arrived, pagan, fierce, and culturally distinct, the old Roman faith flickered out. It would not return for nearly 2 centuries. But buried in Lullingstones, soil beneath layers of tile and moss, it remained. Not practiced, not preached, just preserved. Legacy of the quiet places. Most histories favor noise wars, kings, dramatic change. But places like Lullingstone tell another story, that slow change, like slow erosion, may be the most enduring of all. You walk the same earth. The hill still rises gently above the Darent River. Children still chase rabbits across the fields, and beneath their feet a temple still sleeps. Maybe that's the lesson. Not that belief disappears, but that it sinks. And when it's time, it rises again softly on the end of a farmer boy's stick. Final reflections in the grand scheme of things. Lullingstone is just one villa. It didn't host emperors. It wasn't the site of miracles. It was a home, a chapel, and a tomb. And that makes it more important, not less. So most histories like this quiet, buried, lived rather than declared. It's in the toys under floorboards, the soot in the hearth, and the unmarked grave. Turn toward the rising sun. It's in the questions we still ask. What else have we built over? How many gods lie sleeping under our farms? What will we leave for others to find 15 centuries from now? You are standing in a frost-bitten village in England, years 1086. The air stings your lungs, and your boots sink into cold mud. The fields lie dormant, the oxen thin and sullen from lean winters, and into this silence comes a rider gloved, cloaked, and flanked by scribes. He asks your name. Then he asks how many pigs you own. How many acres? How much silver? Did your grandfather work this land before the Normans arrived? And you answer not because you want to, but because you must, because the king is counting, and the counting feels permanent. This is not just a survey. This is the Doomsday Book of Royal Order, so vast and so final that people would later say it was like Judgment Day. And it all began, not in triumph, but in fear. A conqueror's anxiety, William of Normandy had won the English crown in 1066. But the land was still restless. Though Harold Godwinson lay dead at Hastings and the old Anglo-Saxon lords were broken, England remained a volatile prize. The north seethed with rebellion. Wales and Scotland loomed. Norman lords held new estates but barely spoke the tongue of the peasants they ruled. And worse still, William did not know what he owned. He had distributed land as rewards to his knights, but the mechanisms of English landholding were ancient, layered, and deeply local. Villages operated under oral memory who planted what, when, and with whose permission. To tax effectively and to rule decisively, William needed something unheard of in England. He needed a comprehensive survey of the kingdom's wealth. Just land, not just livestock, but everything. The order goes out in December of 1085. As snow drifted across the Thames, William held court in Gloucester. There, among firelit walls, he issued one of the most ambitious bureaucratic commands in medieval Europe. He ordered that every landholder in England, barons, bishops, peasants be recorded. Every field measured, every plow counted, every millstone. Noted this was not a tax. It was not a census. It was something else, something deeper, colder. A total inventory of the kingdom itself. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a terse but poignant record, puts it plainly. There was no single hide, nor a yard of land, nor even it is a shame to tell, though it seemed to him no shame to do an ox or one cow or one pig that was not set down in his writing. As in Doomsday, 'cause like the Last Judgment, it allowed no appeal. How it worked, the machinery of the survey, was immense. 2 main volumes survive, Great Doomsday and Little Doomsday, covering Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex in finer detail. Together, they describe over 13,000 places. But how was this achieved in a kingdom with no roads worth naming and few literate men? The process began with royal commissioners, trusted clerks, and clergy dispatched to every shire. These commissioners gathered data from sheriffs, local priests, village elders, landowners. They asked the same set of questions repeatedly. What? Was the land like in the time of King Edward, before the conquest? What was it like when William gave it to its current holder? What is it like now? The triple format allowed William to measure change over time, particularly how wealth had grown or shrunk under Norman rule. This wasn't just a count, it was a political X-ray. Counting pigs, weighing souls, the questions varied from the banal to the existential. Many hides a hide was roughly 120 acres, though it varied. How many plow teams? How many villains? Semi-free peasants. Cotters, poor laborers with tiny plots. How many slaves? Yes, slavery still existed in Anglo-Saxon England, and Doomsday records over 28,000 slaves. Even mills and fish ponds were listed, down to the number of eels paid as rent. But beneath the statistics was a more chilling message. Nothing escaped. The eye in the eye was not local anymore. The king knew. The king had seen, and the king remembered. The death of bread, one unexpected consequence of the Doomsday Survey, was food scarcity. Not that the book caused famine directly, but its efficiency meant that landowners could be taxed with new precision. No longer could a local lord underreport his grain stores or hide surplus pigs. With better records came stricter demands. Rents went up. Livestock was sold off to meet tax quotas. Flour was hoarded by stewards. Commoners felt the squeeze. Some chroniclers write of lean tables and hollow fields in the years following the survey. In a strange irony, the more the king knew, the less the peasants ate. Bread, The daily lifeline of every villager became thinner, more oat and rye, less wheat. Doomsday may not have caused hunger, but it recorded coldly the world that hunger created. Salt, silver, and silence among the many things catalogued. Salt pans stand out. In places like Cheshire and Droitwich, salt was big business, vital. For preservation, seasoning, and even trade, it was often taxed not by volume, but by evaporation capacity. How much brine a salt house could render daily. In some entries, we find exact numbers of men needed to operate a salt pan. The regions list coinage, sometimes down to fractions of a penny. The king wanted to know not just what a village had, but how quickly it could convert it into silver. And over it all loomed a kind of quiet. The survey, for all its scale, records no voices, no names of peasants, no stories, no deaths. Only quantities. The document is silent, but it echoes if you listen. You can almost hear the frost crunch under the hoof of a scribe's mule, the whispered curses of a reeve trying to explain why his village has fewer oxen this year. The hush that follows when the counting is done, 'cause once it's in the book, it's law. End of section. Reflection. The Doomsday Book was not a ledger, it was a spellbinding land, wealth, and people into the service of the crown. But what kind of kingdom needs this level of detail? And what was William really afraid of when he ordered it? Was it rebellion? Was it uncertainty? Or was it something more primal? The fear that his rule was only skin deep and the land might reject him. In the next section, we'll go deeper, not into the data, but into the people behind the entries. Who were the villagers whose lives were reduced to a single line? And what did it mean to be seen by the Doomsday Survey? You turn the stiff, ink-dotted parchment of the Doomsday Book. There is a line for your village. You see it almost buried in the Latin script. 10 villains, 4 borders, 1 plow and lordship, 2 oxen, meadow, 5 acres. That's it. No names, no stories, just measurements. You know this village? You live here. You were born here. The 10 villains. One died last winter. Hildrick, who fed the pigs behind. The hedge. The borders. One is your cousin. The 2 oxen. One has a limp, and the other was stolen by Welsh raiders 3 years ago. But the Doomsday Book doesn't care about that. It records as if the land were still, the world unmoving. The scribes, this is a kingdom of categories, not people. But the people were there, behind every entry. And tonight, we look at them. Who were the villains? Most of the English population in 1086 lived under some form of unfreedom. The largest group was the villains' tenants tied to the land, obligated to provide labor to the lord in exchange. For protection and use of a small plot, villains weren't slaves. They could not be sold individually. 8. But they also weren't free. They needed permission to marry. They had to work the domain lord's land several days a week. If they abandoned their land, they could be pursued and punished. A typical villain might own a pair of goats, a thatched house, and a quarter-acre of barley. His wife likely brewed ale or spun wool. His children foraged in the hedgerows for firewood and mushrooms. A good harvest meant survival. A bad one meant hunger, sometimes worse. The Doomsday Book often mentions villains in bulk, like seed in a sack. 12 villains. And for slaves on 2 plows, 10 villains with 3 borders. Meadow for 1 plow. Each entry might represent entire lives, compressed into numerals, borders, and cotters, the margins of the marginal. Lower on the social scale than villains were the borders and cotters. A borderer typically held a small cottage and little to no land. His duty was often seasonal labor, helping with harvests, maintaining hedges, or serving in the manor. A cotter held, even less perhaps, only his dwelling in a narrow strip of garden. Some were artisans, charcoal burners, or simple day laborers. The Doomsday entries treat them as numbers, but their lives were highly vulnerable. A harsh winter, a failed barley crop, or an increase in manorial dues could push them into destitution. And behind them were the slaves, some native English, some taken during earlier raids. Doomsday lists over 28,000 of them. 1 in 10 people in some counties. Some were born into it. Others may have fallen into slavery through debt. They are listed not by name, but as assets. 7 slaves, 2 women, 5 men. 1 line, no details. The lords who collected above, these villagers, sat the tenants and chef the men, who held land directly from King William. After the conquest, William had redistributed English land with ruthless efficiency. Only a handful of Anglo-Saxon lords retained their holdings. The rest were Norman knights, bishops, abbots, and royal relatives. Among the most powerful was Robert of Mortain, William's half-brother, who held nearly 800 manors. Count Alan of Brittany, who possessed vast lands in the north. Bishop Odo of Bayeux, the king's half-brother, who commissioned the Bayeux tapestry, and owned hundreds of estates. These men were not gentle landlords. They collected dues. They demanded labor. They oversaw forests where poaching was punishable by death. The Doomsday Book gave them clarity and thus power. If a tenant owed 12 sheaves of wheat per year, the book confirmed it. If a mill could grind 3 sacks of flour per day, the book noted it. No more room for forgetfulness. The forgotten things, though vast, the Doomsday Book doesn't tell us everything. It skips London and Winchester, 2 of the kingdom's most important cities. It omits full entries for parts of the north, especially around Northumbria, which was still recovering from the devastating harrying of the north, 1069–70. When William's forces burned villages and slaughtered livestock to suppress rebellion. In some places, the scribe simply wrote, Wasta est. It is a waste. But what does waste mean? Sometimes it meant depopulated. Sometimes it meant unprofitable. Sometimes it meant ruined, burned-out villages, the fields fallow, the streams choked with ash. These aren't just statistics. These are ghost towns, still visible in the book if you know where to look. From land to landscape, Doomsday entries were organized by shire and hundred, a system of territorial units. But they also revealed a landscape in motion. We learn about woodland was measured by the number of pigs it could support. For example, woodland for 40 pigs. Pasture noted for how many animals could graze. Salt pans in Cheshire and Lincolnshire. Fisheries and rivers are sometimes taxed in eels. Vineyards England had small-scale wine production, especially in the south. The book doesn't describe what these places looked like, but it implies a network of fields, forests, marshes, streams, and coastlines, a web of survival. Behind every calculation was someone digging, planting, fishing, or baking. Monks and margins clergy were among the largest landholders recorded in Doomsday. Monasteries like Ely, Ramsey, and Glastonbury held swaths of land. Their entries often include the number of monks supported, the holdings granted by former kings, the alms are owed to the poor. Some even record the obligations of specific churches. One entry notes that a village church must maintain a lantern lit for the souls of the dead every evening. Yet these records also show how powerful religious institutions had become. Some abbeys owned over 50 manors. They collected rents, ran markets, and, in some cases, commanded armies. The Doomsday Book made their holdings explicit and, thus, taxable. Even heavenly power had to answer to William. The psychology of being measured for most people. The Doomsday Survey was not about accuracy. It was about visibility, a terrifying kind. To be counted was to be exposed. This wasn't just a royal curiosity. It was a reminder that you were not hidden. The book looked back 3 kings deep. It asked not only what you had, but what your father and grandfather had. For a society built on oral history and tradition, this was shocking. A new form of memory had entered the kingdom, not the memory of the village elder or parish priest, but the parchment memory of the state. And unlike stories, it could not be forgotten. The birth of bureaucracy, Doomsday marked a turning point not just in English history, but in European statecraft. It was a sign that the king no longer ruled simply by sword, but by quill. From this point on, royal authority began to harden into institutions, tax systems based on written records. Disputes are settled by documents, not oaths. Lords were expected to produce charters proving their claims. Even resistance changed. Villagers learned to forge or misplace records. Some fled to towns, seeking anonymity in the growing boroughs. In many ways, Doomsday was the first step toward modern surveillance. It was medieval but not feudal. It was not about loyalty. It was about legibility. Became the less control you had. End of section reflection. In this section, we saw the people behind the parchment, the villains, the boarders, the abbots, and the scribes. We've seen how the Doomsday Book turned lives into lines and land, into data. But how was this vast document used once completed? Was it ever opened again, or was it shelved as a royal trophy? And in a world where change was constant, war, famine, rebellion, how long could a single snapshot hold power? In the next and final section, we'll explore the legacy of Doomsday, how it shaped English governance, legal systems, and our modern understanding of information control. You are standing in a vaulted room. A single shaft of light filters through a high-arched window. Before you lies a book not large, not gilded, not decorated. Its cover is plain. Its pages are rough ink. Fading, but it is heavy. Heavier than it looks. It is the Doomsday Book, and it has not moved in over 900 years. The book survived, unlike many medieval documents burned in wars, eaten by rats, forgotten in monasteries. The Doomsday Book survived. It outlived kings. It sat through civil wars. It waited while parliaments rose and fell. By the 13th century, it was already called Doomsday, as in the Day of Judgment, because it seemed so final, so total. Just as no soul escapes God's ledger, no manner escaped Doomsday. Monks at Westminster began storing it in the royal treasury. It became a reference. For legal disputes, a touchstone for ownership. Even centuries later, a noble could open the book and say, "My land was held by my grandfather before the conquest." See, it is written here. The book became proof. And in England, proof became power. Doomsday in the courts in the 12th and 13th centuries, the Doomsday Book took on a second life in the courtroom. Lawyers cited it to settle property disputes. Judges referenced it when deciding between rival claims. It wasn't perfect, of course. Land had changed hands. New villages had appeared. But in a world with no other universal record, Doomsday was better than memory. By the reign of Edward I, 1270s, officials used the book in land commissions. 1279 court case in Norfolk cited the Doomsday Book to confirm a lord's claim over a disputed marsh. It even helped determine feudal duties, how much a noble owed in military service or tax, and still no one altered it. Even in error, it was sacred. The bureaucratic inheritance, but Doomsday didn't just sit on a shelf. It inspired generations of record-keeping. In 1194, King Richard I ordered a new royal survey called the Articles of the Heir. In 1279, the 100 Rolls attempted a more detailed follow-up to Doomsday. Later came the Valar Ecclesiasticus under Henry VIII used to assess church wealth before the dissolution of the UHL. And tonight, we look at them. Who were the villains? Most of the English population in 1086 lived under some form of unfreedom. The largest group was the villains' tenants tied to the land, obligated to provide labor to the lord in exchange. For protection and use of a small plot, villains weren't slaves. They could not be sold individually. But they also weren't free. They needed permission to marry. They had to work the domain lord's land several days a week. If they abandoned their land, they could be pursued and punished. A typical villain might own a pair of goats, a thatched house, and a quarter-acre of barley. His wife likely brewed ale or spun wool. His children foraged in the hedgerows for firewood and mushrooms. A good harvest meant survival. A bad one meant hunger, sometimes worse. The Doomsday Book often mentions villains in bulk. Exceed in a sack. 12 villains and 4 slaves on 2 plows. 10 villains with 3 boarders, meadow for 1 plow. Each entry might represent entire lives compressed into numerals, monasteries. Each survey became more detailed, more bureaucratic, and more focused on revenue. Doomsday had proven the power of writing things down. It reduced corruption. It increased accountability. It made lords and villagers visible to the state. Once the state had this power, it never gave it back. A stagnant mirror, but there was a darker side to this permanence. Doomsday froze the kingdom. For decades after 1086, there are signs that innovation stalled. In many areas, land tenure was rigid. Tax systems were modeled on doomsday entries, even when conditions changed. Lords clung to what they could prove. Villagers feared improvements that might increase their obligations. A man who cleared new forests for grazing might soon find his taxes raised because now the land was more valuable, so people stayed still. It was safer. The book meant to organize the kingdom also paralyzed it, the gaps between words. Despite its reach, Doomsday remains full of gaps. We don't know how many women held land. It's only a few dozen are named, often widows or abbesses. We don't know how children lived or what they were taught. We don't know the local names of most villages, only the ones scribes chose. There are no descriptions of famine, though we know the early 1080s brought terrible harvests. No mention of epidemics, no trace of songs, festivals, or grief. But these things were there, in the dirt behind the hedgerows. You can almost hear them. The book today, the Doomsday Book, is kept at the National Archives in Kew, England. It is bound in 2 volumes, Great Doomsday, covering most of England, Little Doomsday, covering Essex, Norfolk, and Suffolk. So detailed it was never compressed into the main volume. It has been digitized. You can view it online, leaf through a 1,000-year-old census with a click. Some entries are surprisingly short. In Wooton, 3 hides. Land for 2 plows. 4 villains, 3 boarders. A mill worth 3 shillings. Others span paragraphs. But they all echo, because Doomsday isn't about numbers, about presence. This village existed. These people lived. And now, so many years later, they still do in ink. A broader legacy outside England. Doomsday influenced ideas about centralized state control. The Norman model of royal taxation and land survey spread to Normandy, parts of France, and even the Crusader states. It showed that a strong king didn't need a strong army, he needed strong information. William had used data to conquer again, this time not by sword but by scroll. And this would echo for centuries, like Cadaster Napoleonian. In 19th century France, the Ottoman Tahrir defters, Soviet and Chinese land registers in the 20th century, and even the modern census, a tool governments use to map, control, and plan. It began here, with that heavy, plain book in the vault. A spiritual document? Strangely, some later writers saw the Doomsday Book as more than political. They called it a moral document, a judgment, not just on property, but on behavior. Be listed was to be accountable. To have land was to be responsible. Some sermons in the 12th century used Doomsday as a metaphor for God's own ledger. Just as William recorded your plows, so God would record your sins. Even now, in some corners of Britain, the word Doomsday still carries a chill. It meant finality, no appeal, just what it was. The book that would not burn in the Second World War as German bombs fell on London. British archivists quietly packed the Doomsday Book into a safe. They stored it in a secure location in the countryside, believing, perhaps rightly, that if London fell, this book must not be lost. It was more than a national treasure. It was the beginning of something, of surveillance, of order, of writing that lasts longer than memory. Many great libraries burned. Great kings vanished. Castles fell. But the book remains. Final reflection. So here we are, nearly 1,000 years later. You've followed the ink lines from Norman scribes to modern databases. You've met villains who thatched roofs and abbots who brewed ale. You've seen how being written down can mean safety or danger. The Doomsday Book is not beautiful. It is not poetic. It tells no jokes. But it is perhaps the most honest book of its time. It recorded lives as they were, fleeting, limited, tethered to weather and duty, but not invisible. Its greatest lesson may be this, that to know a people, we must look at the boring things. The crop yields, the plows, the forgotten fish ponds. Because in those lines, the past still breathes. So next time you walk through an English village, past an old hedge or stone boundary, remember, it may have been listed. and that listing may have saved it.